Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats.
You know, ideas have to start from somewhere. And if you're within the sound of my voice, that must mean you are in the seats with, once again, as always, my name is Dave Voigt, and I am your host for this for this podcast where we pick the brains of a wide variety of industry professionals, and we sort of not just talk about their current projects, but we talk about influences, what got them into the business, the whole nine yards. And if you need to find this podcast, you can subscribe to us on Apple, on Spotify, or as always, you can find everything archived over at YouTube. And also, there's the social media. Please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at either at In the Seats or at It's Podcast One for all the latest updates. And finally, please visit us where it all started over at intheseats.ca for all the latest and greatest movie news, reviews, and all sorts of fun stuff underneath the sun. On today's episode, we're diving into the Magic Factory. We're talking a little inside Pixar, which is a new docu-series that launched on Disney Plus today. It really allows for us to look at the people who work inside Pixar and just sort of the moments, how scenes can come about and how things can come about and how ideas are formed in this proverbial magic factory, as it were. We talk with directors Erica Milsom and Tony Kaplan, who are behind the series, just a little bit about how they got started, influences, sort of the logistics of trying to shoot and pitch projects while underneath this huge umbrella that is Pixar Studios, and so much more. And we start this interview in progress because I forgot to press record and I missed the first minute or so. But it's Erica talking about just sort of how they initially pitched the idea for it to be a thing, and not just sort of this big expansive documentary, but this really sort of fascinating short docuseries which focuses on the moments that get created inside Pixar, which is, I think, between you and me, what makes it so special. All right, enjoy.
With talking to the people, getting more intimate with the creators, and like not necessarily the people who are all film directors or voices that you've heard from before. And I think that started to really dictate the length. Do you agree, Tony?
Well, I think we were allergic to the sort of tendency for a lot of stuff on streaming to be longer than it needs to be.
Drone shots, so many long drone shots.
So, we wanted them to feel entertaining, and we were thinking like these collections, you literally would play one back to back. So let's say Inspired could be an hour-long show if you simply played them at once, but they felt like each one needed to stand on its own and be entertaining throughout and not have any filler, I guess. I think that's what we're a little allergic to filler, I guess.
Yeah.
And we wanted it to have content throughout.
How did you boil it down thematically? Because I imagine obviously in a place like Pixar, you have hundreds of stories to work from.
Well, one of the things that came up was we started talking to people. We started doing these coffee chats, trying to talk to people to try to find subjects to cover. And even though Erica and I have been there for, 15, 16 years, there were things about the process that neither of us, in the process of doing this series, realized there are some things we don't understand ourselves. And some roles and creative processes that we weren't necessarily 100% clear on. And so that guided us in some ways. That in the process of trying to find out more about that world, we ended up meeting people who we thought would be great subjects. So I feel like it was both our ignorance and then letting our ignorance guide us to these people was really great.
And it's funny because I think Inspired is not so much, that's probably not the areas that we were unfamiliar with, but they were some new people there for sure. Like out of the 20 episodes, there's some that are really like just focused on like, how do you explain hard to explain things? So those are farther, those aren't out yet. But we did end up like doing, I feel like we did at least 100 coffee chats over the course of these 20 episodes, just trying to narrow it down to the right group of people for this first season, like who are the ones who have a great story to tell, would not mind being followed around to the extent that we need to follow people around to get these very personal, evocative, fully realized senses of their personality, in addition to like the theme that they are presenting on screen. So
and it seemed like as we were going through this, it did seem like vulnerability came up. This Deanna being willing to be messy and not really know how to do something, or Dan really like, I don't know, I don't have any idea what I'm going to do here. And being willing to be vulnerable on that level, and then vulnerable in the sense that we went into their houses, we went in, we met. We don't usually do that kind of stuff where for working on sort of behind the scenes making of, where you go to someone's hometown and just meet their mom and eat pizza casserole or something like that.
Steve Hunter, yeah,
it isn't the kind of thing we generally do. And so these people were willing to be vulnerable both about their creative process and about their personal lives.
I mean, and that's amazing, because I mean, on one end, I mean, I know it's the old line, it takes a village to make a movie, but I mean, it's at a place like Pixar, it seems like it takes a very large city to make a movie.
And it's true.
And I'm curious from your perspective, because I love how you mentioned before just how there were things that you didn't necessarily know. I'm kind of curious, during this whole process, what did you learn sort of in the sort of machinations of the Pixar process?
Well, a lot of it is like there were some technical things that that aren't really part of this first 5 collection that I think I was like, I don't know how we would get it, because we give tours. When you work at Pixar, you end up giving tours of Pixar a lot. Yeah. And invariably there's a 14-year-old who's really smart who asks the question that you cannot answer. Like, well, what do you mean 3D in the computer? Do you have to wear glasses to work on these movies? Or how does that work exactly? Why do we have 3 dimensions in the film? Mm-hmm. And trying to, even stuff that you kind of, I mean, maybe I had a sense of what it was, but I couldn't explain it in any meaningful way. And it was only through this process that we really got to that, I think.
Also, like with Jess, it's weird, but the script supervisor thing, like I think I knew what a script supervisor did, and it became so much more clear through this process, like how this one person who sits between different departments, it's not like she's the writer, it's not like she's in the editorial, it's not like she's an animator, she's a person in the midst, or a director, but she is in everything with all those characters, keeping this one entity alive and accurate. And that how living the Pixar script was really interesting to me. I just was like, oh, I knew it, but I didn't know it until I started like trying to explain it to someone else. This is often the case with documentary. You're like, oh yeah, I know that. And then you're like, wait, do I know it as well as I thought I did? And how do I tell someone else, right? Like, because it's like, you can kind of get it yourself, but I feel like that's the power of like the documentary form, is how do I present this to another audience and make it, felt, heard, seen, and understood. So yeah, that was kind of, I think Jess, and then Deanna, just like, she inspired me so much with that, like knowing that you don't have to stay in your lane, that to create something takes a sense of like adventure and bravery of just trying a new medium like that. I just love it. It was so fun. I mean, it's really funny, but I feel like watching her do that, like maybe I knew that, but I didn't know how powerful it was in someone's creative process. And with Deanna, I feel like I just was like, oh, gotcha, it's here.
And one last thing about that is, I think one of the things I learned was how much a single idea can have so many ramifications across a movie. And this idea that I think it's in the Dan piece about Onward, that it was just this one realization about his life that led to the entire story, rather than like, a bunch of ideas that he was trying to get across, but maybe couldn't verbalize or, articulate in a way that created a story arc. But he really had one thing that made that entire movie happen. That was a revelation.
Were you guys able to sort of shoot and structure sort of each episode sort of on the go? Because I mean, I've got to imagine, because there's always going to be multiple projects at once, there may have been situations where it's like, no, we can't shoot today, we're at a critical junction for Soul, go away, do something else. Like, how do you sort of navigate that sort of internal balance?
Were you there? That's like, it's so funny because like we did, we're using a different shooting crew than we used to, several different crews than we used to. And so what I love about these and about all the crews and all the people who came in and did it was that is exactly what happened. Like we would have an intention, we would have a strategy, particularly at the studio, and you'd walk in and it would explode and you'd be like, okay, instead of doing that, like we're doing 5 different things related to 5 different characters, and we're going to help guide you through that. That happened frequently. I think that though I think Tony and I both kept our overall philosophy of like, when we went through and did our production plans for like what we wanted for each episode, it's there, right, Tony? I don't think we lost anything. It just, I mean, like, how do we accomplish it? Shifted for sure.
One of the things that was interesting for us, because we're usually at the studio, was that this time we were able to leave the studio, leave the boundaries of the studio, and do some things outside. And sometimes that was amazing because at the studio, it's exactly as you said, like, oh, you can't shoot today on this because the whatever, like the widget isn't working, or
right, yeah,
that person is feeling anxiety and they don't want to be shot. But when you're out there with them and they're stuck with you, they don't have that choice. You're with them in a way that is different. So I think every sort of bullet point in our original production plan and our episode layout, I think, is in all of these, despite the reality of what you say. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
This must have felt like having to put together a large jigsaw puzzle, because I mean, just sort of the logistics of trying to shoot 20 episodes, but it's a little bit here, it's a little bit there. Like, how does that sort of invigorate you guys, just sort of as documentary filmmakers? Because I've got to imagine there's a lot of people who couldn't necessarily pull that off, or it just takes a lot of organizing to pull it off, to be able to sort of have the wherewithal to find the structure to sort of, and the willpower to get it all as you need to get it done.
Well, can I have 2 notes on that? Number one, our team is amazing. And we have like people who just constantly dove in and negotiated with the studio and with the location. We have, sort of folks we hired from the outside, but we have an internal team who are like phenomenal at that, at like kind of stacking the schedule. And then I think Tony and I, for the 15 years that we've been at Pixar, have like, I think, in a way that's different than, I never really thought of this, but I think we're different than a lot of production crews in that we're always thinking of like 5 movies at once anyways. We're telling 5 stories at once. We're just, some stories are far away and some stories are this year. But so we have, over the years, always had this, usually we're like pitching to one team, developing a pitch for another team, executing the final product for another feature film team. So we've kind of, don't you feel, I mean, I feel like it didn't feel that different in managing these 20, I mean, it felt a little extra crazy, but
it was sort of an intense, concentrated version of what we generally have been doing, which is, again, there's 5 movies in production at any one given time, plus a couple shorts, plus, whatever side projects we've got going on there. So it sometimes it was a little bit like, sometimes you'd be walking along and you'd see something happening over the corner with a different subject.
And you're like, go get that.
Let's go follow that instead. This is fine, but I think that's really the gold over there. So it was as you say, it was a pretty complicated task, but we have the best job in the world. We're really lucky, even when it's hard. So.
Well, and I think part of that is also that Tony and I have worked together for so long. We co-created this. We knew each other's projects really well. And it's funny because I've worked spent some time in Hollywood, and then there's, double up days and places where you're having to use the same crew for 2 different projects at once. And there can be a sense of like competition in that. And I think for us, there's just like, we've had this partnership for so many years that it's very much a collaboration of like, that if a crew comes in and we have to renegotiate, like we have each other's priorities in mind. Like we also sort of know philosophically, like the studio, like we know if we see something that's in support of a project that's not ours, like we know that we want to capture that. Like, I think both Tony and I really adore this place. and adore these people that we're telling the stories about, and want to do like the best story we can possibly, like give them to the audience in the best possible way. So it's a little like, sometimes I think it's a little different, just partially because we are so mind melded, you know, like ourselves, but also our team, that there is just like a very intrinsic sense of like every one of these episodes is going to be awesome, and we should be supporting them as we go along as much as possible.
What brought you both underneath the one umbrella? Because that dynamic of just pitching documentary projects for behind the scenes stuff sort of under the one studio really kind of fascinates me. Like, what brought you both to this place at this time?
A
Wow,
temp job. I got a temp job as an assistant editor on Finding Nemo because I could do documentary assisting. And so I feel like we've just grown into it on my side. But you got hired as a video. Maybe you got hired. Got hired for real, Tony. I got a temp job, but I kept getting fired.
I had a strangely, especially for the Bay Area, specific background in making documentaries about films being made.
Okay.
So I had come from Lucasfilm and working on the Star Wars movies in the behind the scenes capacity there. And so my background was more in traditional documentary. That's what I had studied, and had worked on some, PBS stuff and things like that. But ended up at Lucasfilm, and it seems like since then that's been my niche is the making ofs. And in many ways, this project Inside Pixar, even though it still is in some ways making of, it's a great opportunity to kind of broaden that just a little bit and really look at a person more than a single feature film, which is really exciting to me. But yeah, that's how somehow, and I don't know how, I wish I could say, well, it was because of X. That's how I ended up at Pixar doing these things and then pitching this stuff. But it all, like, I guess with most people's lives, it's a twisty turn.
But I do think the two of us, like, if you look at, so it's weird, I was in educational documentary before this, and I was particularly working on like these longitudinal studies about literacy, and watching these classrooms unfold, and then kind of like finding the story for, logging, telling the editor what I thought the story was. And I feel like Tony shoots all kinds of things. And I think actually like we kind of grew into directing because we are both very keyed into like, what is the story that's emerging through the time that you're with somebody. So this idea that we're constantly sort of scattershot, like he was shooting it all and I was logging it all in the beginning, but I think that we both saw stories within that, and we're pretty good at reflecting, like among, like if you have a high shooting ratio, which we did definitely at the beginning, we're a little lower than we used to be, but it was very verite. It was like we were out there shooting all the time. And then when it's not verite and we're interviewing, we interviewed a lot of people. So I feel like the two of us kind of just developed this way of finding the core stories to tell within like all these different shows and all these different years. It was like, I think that's sort of how we became who we are.
We're like embedded journalists a little bit in the culture of Pixar.
I like that. Yeah.
Yeah. And but one of the things that's happened is because we're embedded, we have a lot of relationships with these people that are many films. So I think that we were sort of uniquely positioned to be inside Pixar and to tell this story.
Now, I guess just to put a bow on this with the last question, because I think a part of the draw for sort of the Pixar universe from fans is that it always feels like the people working there are taking part in their own sort of film university or film sort of culture in and of themselves. And I'm kind of curious, what did you two learn as filmmakers during this whole process, following the people who make these films?
That's a great question. Yeah.
I mean, it's funny because I feel like I didn't go to school for film, I went to school for a whole different thing. So I always think of that Pixar has been this very long graduate school for me of film. Like this is where I learned what filmmaking is over the whole course of it. And I think maybe if I were to talk about inside Pixar, it's like I think just learning, reinvesting in the personal passion, and this is actually for Inspired particularly, how to invest in the passion behind the project, right? Like how I feel like that's the thing that Inspired reminded me of and like really illuminated, like, there's a process when you create something of like wholly putting yourself into it, and like, how do you do that, and what is the shape of making that happen, I guess, for me. I don't know, Tony, what about you?
How much vulnerability plays a role, this willingness to sort of put your soul out there in this way that maybe I hadn't necessarily thought of before, or hadn't had a visceral experience of before, and this need to be willing in this process to keep, I mean, maybe it's a deeper sense that you have to keep pushing at things. It's those last sort of 4%. You can get to 96, and then those last 4%, you need to kind of lay it all out on the table and give it your all on those last little bits. You can't let go ever, really. And I saw that a lot in the way that people who we covered created stuff, were creative, and that's one of the things I feel like I took away on this one with me.
Well, and you know what? I think you're right. I think this is a beautiful little series that's going to bring out those little extra nuances in these fantastic films. And I just want to say thanks for the time today. I really appreciated it.
Thank you, David. So nice to meet you, and thanks
Nice
for
to
that.
meet you guys.
Can't wait to see what you make out of it.